inclusive mobility systems in African cities. We have spoken to many of you already to get your reflections and feedback and find areas of synergy. We're now opening this up to a wider audience, and we want to say Digital Transport for Africa is here and we are ready to work with you. We have an exciting agenda for the next 2 days. Today we'll have presentations to set the stage for why we're all convening for this event. Tomorrow we'll be delving a bit into some of the different parts of the public transport ecosystem, starting from the data mapping and tools to the applications that are developed using the data, to leveraging big data, and coming full circle to end with a session on what is the impact and change we want to see on the ground and what is needed to get there. So with that, we will get started. To kick us off, we'll have welcome remarks and a short presentation by Aklilu Fikrasilase, the director of WRI Africa's Thriving Resilient Cities program, Ben Whaley, the director of Integrated Transport and Innovation of WRI Global Cities program, and Antoine Chevre, the senior transport specialist in the mobility division of the French Development Agency. I will then pass it on to Jackie Klopp, who's the co-director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development at the Earth Institute at Columbia University and a dear friend and founding partner of Digital Transport for Africa, so she can get us started with our session for today. So with that, Tolga, if you can go to the slide for the presentations, we can get started. Is Aklilu here? Sorry.
Yes, Aklilu just joined.
Okay. Welcome, Aklilu. Over to you. Aklilu, I think you're muted. Okay, Emily, I think Aklilu's having with his mic, so I'll just get started with the first slide and hopefully he'll be able to join us.
Okay, I'm private chatting him as well to see if I can help.
Okay, great. So we'll just get started. Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. Just a little bit about what Digital Transport for Africa is. In 2017, as an initial response to the challenges around public transport in African cities, partners from the World Resource Institute, Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, the French Development Agency, Columbia University, and MIT created Digital Transport for Africa, a collaborative digital commons and global network that works to scale and support urban mobility projects through open standardized data, open source software, and peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. It was really aimed to provide support for government, tech companies, civil society actors, to map city transit networks and foster ecosystems and skills that enable cities to leverage data for critical transport improvements. DT4A represents a large, diverse network of city authorities, residents, universities, private civic technology companies, and international development groups that you see here, committed really to sustainable urban mobility for all the principles of open data. Members of DT4A, we pledge to advance safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable urban transport systems for all, as described by the Sustainable Development 11.2 goal. Our vision is underpinned by 4 policy goals adapted to the unique transportation landscape of urban Africa and a broad commitment to quality open data. Aklilu, are you able to join us? I still can't.
No, I can see you. I'm using my phone now. I don't know when. So proceed, please, Iman.
Okay, thank you, Aklilu. Next slide, please, Tolga. So the DT4A website has many sort of uses. The first is that first it was established so that those who wanted to learn about transit mapping could have access to open source tools and resources to really be able to map their transportation systems. And for those who were mapping or have mapped, they could share their data and experiences. And the Resource Center also had the repository where data sets were available and easily accessible, and links to other repositories that had the transit data. So currently DT4A has data sets from 14 African cities, and it's in General Transit Speed Specification, GTFS format, which is the common format for public transportation schedules. We hope not only to increase the number of data sets, but also diversify the format of the data sets that we host on the website. Next slide, please, Tolga. I think all of us here know why we want to solve the transportation problem, why solving the transportation problem is key to getting Africans' urbanization right. The paper that was published by Guardian states that by 2100, the world's population centers will have shifted to Asia and Africa. Without this growth even happening, we are seeing serious urban issues in many cities across the globe. So we can only imagine what will happen if business as usual continues. Next slide, please, Tolga. So why a focus on Africa? Urban growth in African cities has largely been unplanned, unregulated, and uncoordinated, resulting in the explosion of slums and urban sprawl that drives up the cost of living and really exacerbates the urban inequality in African cities. The issues are many, and while Africa may be ill-prepared to manage coming growth, the continent is also in a very historic phase of rapid city building, creating transport infrastructure and systems that will shape the continent far into the future. The continent is now at a crucial moment to curtail growth in carbon emissions, reduce fatalities and serious injuries, improve air quality, and provide better accessibility. With massive investments in the horizon, shifting towards an integrated planning approach that focuses on improving access to livelihood opportunities for all residents than an elite few, Africans really have the opportunity to build back better and more accessible cities. Next slide, please. So this is no new solution to the problem. And the million-dollar question is really how. The how is complex and it's different for each of the cities we work in, then the common factor we have identified is data. Data has the potential to unlock many opportunities. First, having the data helps us understand the problem. Most of the public transport in Africa is informal and thus often ignored or sidelined when talking about urban issues. When we have the data demonstrating that the informal paratransit sector is providing 70% of the transportation services in many African cities, means that we can no longer ignore the impact that they have. Without data, we're making decisions in the dark. The solutions we recommend will not be sustainable, and we cannot properly analyze and plan. Secondly, once you have the data, there's so much you can do with it. In this digital age, the tools, the technologies available really unlocks the opportunities for rapid, complex analysis across many sectors, thus getting us to this integration that we want. With only 18 of the big African cities having mapped their public transport and having it available in open data formats, there is still a lot of work to do. We know that there are many more data sets out there, but if it's not shared, if it's not accessible, the chances of it being utilized is low and the chances of it being outdated is very high. So we know there are also a lot of cities that want to map their transit, but don't have the resources or know how to do so. So our focus now is on transit data, but really the wider goal of leveraging transit data is to move towards a more integrated, holistic approach to city planning and development. Next slide, please, Tolga. We have learned a lot in the last 4 years, and in our one-to-one meetings and roundtable discussions that we've had from our event, we've also learned a lot from you. So there's few key takeaways that I'd like to focus on. The first is really the focus on sustainability of mapping projects. Many mapping initiatives end up becoming one-off projects, and very quickly the data becomes outdated. And since cities are so dynamic, especially with all the infrastructure and investment happening in African cities, the transit mapping projects have to be progressive and continuous. The cities need to feel ownership of this work and have the processes and systems in place where they take lead in continuously updating and maintaining the data. Another key lesson is that it cannot stop there. Even if a transit map is produced, it also needs an ecosystem of stakeholders that support with data collection, that build on the data through research and innovation to keep the data alive and relevant. Our biggest takeaway is that we need to go beyond mapping. So we're very excited to hear from Freetown's experience later and see how not only did they map the data, but have really used it to inform transportation planning and improvement in the city. Many times we have found that public transport authorities have challenges in hosting or storing the data, and the DT4A platform is a good alternative, but we also
Apologies, I think Iman's connection dropped. Aklilu, are you able to speak at all?
Can you hear me? My network is so.
Yes, we can hear you on your phone. That sounds great. I'll keep an eye out for Iman's rejoining. She is back.
Iman.
Yes, hi everyone. Sorry about my connection.
No worries. Yes, we can hear you.
So really, many times we have found that public transport authorities have challenges in hosting or storing the data. So the platform has been a good alternative, but we also want to work with transport authorities, local universities, and others to find options as well so that many more people can access and use it. We know that the 14 data sets we have are not the only ones out there. There are data sets available from already completed projects, from ongoing projects and future projects. And so we really want to make sure we're able to collect and upload all of these onto the resource center. Linked to this is the quality and the reliability of the data. We are in discussion with some of our key partners on how we can develop benchmarks to ensure the quality of the data sets that are uploaded, but to also not put too many requirements that we lose having the data there in the first place. Finally, we want to ensure that the resource center becomes the go-to place when it comes to public transportation data, mapping, tools, and uses for African cities. Currently, most of the users of the websites are DT4A partners, and now many African organizations and institutions use it. So we really want to work hard on promoting this website more and having the right content so it meets the needs of the target audience. Next slide, please. So we want to collaborate with you to do this. We know to reach the scale and impact that we want, we know that we cannot work alone. So we really want to work together with city leaders to provide the technical assistance and build the technical capacity so that they're able to bring on the sustainability of the projects that we're talking about. We want to work with researchers and universities that could help undertake the mapping and the data collection. And we want to help and work with innovators so they are able to use the data to develop the applications and test their pilots and experiment with innovative business models. And finally, work with NGOs, civil society, and organizations to help convenings of local and global transportation, to also participate in the convenings of local and global transportation events that we have, and also strengthen the consortium of dedicated partners that we have. Next slide, please, Tolga. So our aim is really set into these 4 main goals. The first is that we want to see in the next 3 years, we want to see 3 to 4 of the cities go beyond mapping. So not just producing the maps, but building on that and making the changes that we want to see on the ground. The second is that we want at least 10 cities to have built local mapping capacity. So have the sustainable means embedded within the cities, whether it's through the university or the authorities. We want to have trainings, workshops, and convenings targeted at 15 cities. And finally, we want to increase the use of the resource center and have active content that's very valuable and useful to our users. Next slide, please.
Did we lose Iman again?
I believe so, yes. Still on the line, but I think the connection is cut.
Shall I continue or?
That'd be great. Thanks, Ben. She's dropped off and I'll keep an eye out for her rejoining as well.
Okay. Well, sorry. Digital transport, it's apropos that we have problems with digital issues around Wi-Fi. So anyway, thank you all for bearing with us. But as Iman was about to explain, we're working on I'm Ben Welly from WRI, by the way. Hello to all, thank you for joining. We're working on a Digital Transport for Africa pledge that partners to the initiative will sign up for. This has been an ongoing discussion, but basically the principles of this are that we agree to promote these core principles of accessibility, efficiency, and low carbon transport and safety. But and as more to the point of Digital Transport for Africa, adhering to the principles of open data, that open data on where public transport goes, where it stops, and is available to the public, that there's availability and access to this data, and that it's available to reuse and redistribute according to international open data standards.
And it does look like Iman is back, just a heads up.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben, for stepping in.
Hi, Iman. Are you able to continue? Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
I just summed up the pledge, which as you can see too, has the relation to some of the sustainable development goals. But Iman, you can continue into the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And sorry all, we're talking about technology and innovation, and somehow that has failed me today. The most exciting part, and I'm glad I'm back for this, is really the upcoming DT4A mini grant that we have. Next slide, please, Tolga. This is really, this is the way that we really want to go beyond mapping. So we've been focused a lot in the past 4 years and really, getting the data out there, really making the case for transit data. But now we want to have this mini grant that would allow for nonprofits, universities, researchers, and/or civil society to apply. And then another sort of category for private sector. We want all these sort of initiatives or projects to be based, of course, in Africa, and to have the support from local government. And the aim is really to provide support for hands-on experience activities that can facilitate open data and digital mapping and really enable improvement in public transport services, particularly paratransit. Next slide, please. So we're still working out the details, but really who's eligible and the activities that are eligible are public transport mapping activities, but using that and showing that the mapping has resulted in something on the ground. It could be digital or app development related activities. It could be capacity building for government officials. So really making the link from having the data and the analysis to on the ground implementation, and then really research on any beyond the mapping scalable sort of use cases of existing data. So please look out for a more detailed announcement. We'll be putting it up on our website and on Twitter, and we really hope you could get us help us get the word out, and we're very excited with the mini grant. Next slide, please. So thank you very much, and thank you for putting up with all the technical difficulties. We'd love to work with you if you have any ideas that sort of relate or align to this work. So please reach out to us at our website, our email address. You can find it on the website, and we hope to connect with you. I'll pass it on to Aklilu and Ben and Antoine to give a few remarks, and then over to you, Jackie. Antoine, would you like to go?
Ah ouais, it's me. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Iman. C'était très très clair, je pense, autour des objectifs de Digital Transport for Africa. Je voulais juste donc déjà vous remercier toute l'équipe de WRI pour la préparation de cet événement et dire que nous, en tant qu'AFD, donc on soutient ce projet à la fois moralement et financièrement, mais que à partir de là, c'est vraiment pour donner les moyens à la communauté, aux différents acteurs de terrain, de proposer des solutions. On n'a pas d'idée très très claire hein, de la manière dont tout ça va se dérouler, et on compte sur l'effervescence et les croisements des compétences pour ça. Et également, nos seuls petits points d'attention sur lesquels on a beaucoup insisté avec WRI, c'est sur la promotion des communs numériques, ça je pense qu'on en a déjà parlé, et bien sûr d'inclure les villes francophones, les villes africaines francophones dans cette initiative. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Antoine. Aklilu, would you like to say a few words?
It looks like Aklilu has actually dropped off. I'll keep an eye out for him.
Great. Ben, would you like to say a few words? If not, I'll pass it on to
No,
you.
I got to chime in on the slide that we had technical problems. So I wanted to just thank everyone for joining. Thanks to Antoine and AFD and the team there, and to all the partners who have joined us here today, and folks from cities across the region and beyond. So thank you, Iman. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Ben. Over to you, Jackie.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. So nice to see many familiar folks in the chat, and new people who are joining this movement. So now we're going to really get into some of the meat of how to get beyond mapping. And it is really my pleasure to introduce a phenomenal panel. We're going to start with Fatima Arroyo, who is in the Transport Global practice at the World Bank. She's a great champion of mapping and going beyond mapping to improve public transit in African cities. And she's also the author of a fantastic work, which I'll promo here, called The Myth and Realities of Informal Transport. We'll then have Frederick Tesfaye, who is part of the Toomey initiative, a great partner for this work at GIZ, to talk to us. And then we have Benji De La Pena. Benji is a friend for a long time, a funder of Digital Matatus that I've been part of. He's CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. He's the chair of an exciting new initiative, the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Be sure to check that out. And he's a founder and director of Agile Partners. He also has a fantastic newsletter that you should all sign up for called Makeshift Mobility. And last but not least, I know we're all very excited to hear about how digital mapping can make a difference on the ground. We have Director Hidolo Shiaka with us today. He is the one of the directors in the Ministry of Transport in Sierra Leone, and he's been working very closely, I believe, with Fatima on some really exciting work in Freetown. So without further ado, you have their impressive bios on the website. I'm going to jump into the panel and invite Fatima to start us off.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you so much for the organization for inviting me to this event. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with you, and also very nice to see some familiar faces in the chat. So hello to everybody. So I'm gonna be doing a presentation today of around 10 minutes about giving an overview about public transport in Africa. No, and I'm based in this presentation about my experience in the last 5 years working in the Africa region, in particular in urban transport. So I'm going to be trying to respond to some key questions like quickly. I think we may have time for more discussions in the Q&A. So the first part of the presentation, I wanted to talk about what are the characteristics of public transport in Africa, no? And here the key two dominant modes of transport in Africa are walking and public transport. And public transport, it is mainly dominated by the informal sector. Even the few cities that have a more consolidated formal transport, such as the case of Cape Town, still informal transport still represent around 50% of the public transport trips. Here, I wanted to show you a small video that I took in the city of Freetown while I was in a shared taxi with some colleagues, and you can have an idea about the key modes of transport that we can see in the cities. So I was in a shared taxi that represents 1/4 of the trips in the city. In front of me, there is a three-wheeler that together with the motorcycles represent another 1/4 of the trips by public transport. And also Poda that are the minibuses are dominant modes of transport there. I also incorporated a graph with the modal split of public transport in the city of Freetown. So what we see here, it's also in the bottom part, different pictures of public transport in African cities where we see diversity in forms of vehicles and overall creative solution actually to provide solutions to the needs to access to jobs and services in cities. The formal modes of transport are in general a small part of public transport in cities. We can see, for example, one picture on the right on the city of Dar es Salaam that has recently developed a bus rapid transit system. And many cities also have a bus public company and owned by government and operated by government that have different names but are in format very similar in many cities in the region, but in general represent really a minimal part of all public transport trips. So as I was mentioning before, the public transport in Africa is very diverse in form, scale, and organization, but is overall dominated by the informal sector. We can see that in general, this informal sector have a relatively common way to operate where they operate without schedules, they don't have formal stops, and they follow a business model where there is an operator that the owner operator that in general is very fragmented, so they just own few vehicles, and there is a driver that basically pay a daily fee to this owner and fights the whole day for passengers and overload the vehicle to be able to cover that target fee every day, and to be able to make benefits. This business model generates a lot of the externalities that are well known about the informal sector, such as the low quality, or about some of the inefficiencies and safety issues. But overall, we have to recognize that informal sector has a lot of strengths, such as their flexibility, their entrepreneurship, their ability many times to provide an almost door-to-door service. So with all of this, what I also wanted to discuss a little bit, it is about why we found this model, this public transport landscape in African cities. And here, there are a few reasons that are behind this current situation. One important one, it has been the speed at which cities have been growing in Africa. Many of the cities are growing at a rate of 4 or 5% annually. And there is a lot of difficulties really to respond to this demand. So there has been a failure of the formal systems to respond to this demand. And that has generated a gap that has been filled by the informal sector. Also, the low densities and the sprawl of cities make much more easy actually for informal vehicles, smaller vehicles to access to these low density areas, and actually they actually can operate in a profit manner rather than the larger vehicle. There is also a very important factor in African cities, which is very young population and high levels of unemployment, for which actually in the informal sector, the informal public transport sector, it is a job opportunity, and there is relatively easy barriers of entry. So for many people, it's actually a job, and it is the premise of having financial results in the short term. So different cities have been taking different approaches to try to improve public transport in the last years in Africa. And we can differentiate 3 key strategies here. What we have called like embrace, displace, and adapt. You know? So one strategy that has been the embrace strategy has been in many cases actually a little bit like laissez-faire, or neglect a little bit the informal sector, in the sense that either because it's considered difficult to improve, or because there is not the right incentives to improve it, it has been a little bit left on the side on public policy. Another option has been really to displace it, or to ban it or replace it. And more what we are seeing, it is a momentum towards the recognition that informal transport has a lot of strengths, and there is a real opportunity there to mitigate those downsides, those weaknesses of the sector, to really improve it. No? And here there are several interesting programs that have aimed to improve the sector through this adapt approach. And I mentioned here 3 of them. That some of them have started years ago. The one in Dakar, for example, started in the early 2000s. But in general, what they have tried, it is on one side to try to control the competition, to change the responsibility towards a collective responsibility rather than individual responsibility in the management on fleet, and also to facilitate the access to finance. So these are 3 key elements that have been implemented. In the case of the Dakar Fleet Renewal Program, that, as I mentioned, started almost 20 years ago and still continue, aiming to provide financial incentives to change toward a collective responsibility of buses in Dakar. A Maputo program also to create cooperatives with similar objective, providing access to a new rolling stock to change towards collective responsibilities, with certain success and failure in that process. And also at this point, are very well known in the case of Cape Town with the pilot project in the 7th Avenue Mitchell's Plain, that also aim to change towards a collective responsibility and showcase the improvements in efficiency and profits for the operators moving towards this collective responsibility. So with this, in talking about all this context about African cities and public transport in African cities, why mapping is important and why go beyond mapping? My experience working in African cities has been, in general, when I arrived to a city, in general, there is very limited information about public transport. So almost immediate first step actually has been trying to map the public transport, both formal and informal, to try to have a first understanding about the supply of transport. No? And here we can see some of these examples of cities that in many cases this has been the first map ever generated in cities. But I think when we try to understand public transport, mapping is the one step or one of the first steps, but we need to go much more beyond that to understand the business model, to understand the political economy, etc. No? So I think this is where I think that it is important to go beyond mapping in order really to transform all this understanding of transport on solutions on the ground. And just here to conclude, three key remarks. The first one, it is that we see a tremendous opportunities to improve public transport in Africa, but at the same time, significant challenges. And one important challenge, it is that there is, in general, in most of the cities, a very important knowledge gap. And here, something that it is very important as a first step towards improving public transport in cities in Africa is going to be to understand better the informal sector. And to do so, the first step it is to understand better how it works, but it's not enough to have improvements on the ground. It needs four things. The first thing it needs to be supported at the highest political level. The second thing is needs a formal institutional framework that allowed to be able to make those changes on the ground. The third thing is need a technical, well-incentivized team of professionals on the ground that can operationalize the changes. And last but not least, it needs willingness for the private sector to be part of these improvements. And in consequence, they need really to see their benefits on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fatima. That's a great presentation to start us off with this discussion. I'm going to invite Frederick to jump in next. And please, questions should go in the Q&A. We're going to have a very vibrant discussion after this, and I'll collect your questions and make sure they get addressed. Frederick.
Okay, thank you, Jackie, and also Fatima. Thanks for that introduction for the first meeting. I'm going to be talking about the role that, or the impact of transport in the relation to the COVID pandemic that everybody felt. I didn't prepare nice presentations like everybody else. I wanted to show a few pictures, kind of go through what the problems were, and then kind of take a deeper look and see what the government's role is, the differences between informal and formal, and some insights on how we can go forward. When I share my screen now, it's actually gonna take my camera off, but I think you'll still be able to hear me. So when it all started, this is, I'm not sure many people have probably seen this, but this is the famous analysis that was done in China of a rider that had infected 9 other people on a bus. And as you could see from the picture, the red man or woman, I think, whoever it was, infected people all over the bus and in random. And at this point, nobody knew everything, nobody knew anything. And everything that happened past this, I think I don't need to tell anybody, we all felt the same effects. But what's the result of this? This means that everything literally just shut down. And as you can see from this graph here, from February until March, all over the world, and this is just taking three countries as an example, completely just fell off the radar. And when we now, as we heard already, transport is a matter of private industry in Africa, meaning that all these people that had their livelihood staked on transport every day, from one day to the next, lost everything. And even the people that had to move and to go to jobs still were forced then to also, take a foot. And although this picture is from India, there's a lot of people that had to do this, and a lot of people still had to go to work, and there was no buses, or they needed to go to another village and had to walk, or had to take other means and cross dangerous roads to be able to move forward. And this demand and drop in demand has really had an impact on many aspects of life and of economy and of the citizens living in cities especially. So now, taking this into consideration, where do we go forward, and what is the government's role in all this? And as already Fatima explained, most of the industry is privately owned. And even if it is formalized, it makes up a very small number or percentage of citizens actually transported. And millions of citizens are reliant on minibuses, taxis, bodabodas, matatus, all the other means, and also the employee side of it. So all the people working in this sector, and from the drivers to the people that wash these cars at the end of the day, there's a big string of people that have been affected. And when we look at the side of the ridership, and most likely due to many inefficiencies, the cost for transport is at a point that is almost unbearable for most citizens, even before COVID. And now that they have created so many different measures against this, and as this picture can see, I'm not sure how good you guys can see. Let me zoom in here a little bit. When we look at the avoid, shift, and improve table, this was created by Toomey sometime in the middle of the first lockdown that we had in 2020. There was a lot of avoid and a lot of shift happening, which really created difficulties between what was needed and what was actually created. And I think that a lot of these things are positive, especially when it comes to the digital side of transport or of government services or of any aspect of life, which is now why we're here and where we can push this forward. A lot of people or a lot of governments created a lot of mandates that were not bearable anymore. So for example, these restrictions of the occupancy within the 14-seater matatus, for example, in Nairobi, were limited to 60%. And now there comes a question of, is there even enough matatus to bring the people around? And can these matatus earn enough money to create the livelihood that they need? Namibia, for example, they increased public transport fares by 15%. And who bears the brunt of these costs? This is then the citizens who have to get on the bus. Joburg, from 10 to 25% were increased to compensate these fare box collections. And the entire system is now under such financial stress. It really begs the question, the differences between the formal and the informal sector really need to now be addressed. And also the question of what public transport is, because in the end, it is a public good that's meant to serve the purpose of creating an environment that can move its citizens from where it needs to go to where it needs to go. And bouncing back from this is going to take a lot of effort and concerted effort from everybody. And I really do believe that this this digital side can really create a basis for the formal as well as the informal sector to really make an improvement. And when we look at the informal sector, this is how the streets were during COVID, and all the minibus workers, conductors, paratransit system, everything was completely closed. And for example, in Monrovia, 11% of jobs are linked directly to the transport sector. So these lockdowns and these long-term effects of public transport limitations and people's worries of even getting onto these buses are still relevant, and they will be relevant for the coming time. A lot of cities stepped up their financial support for these operators. So in Dakar and Abidjan, they provided compensation, but only for the formal bus sector. And these buses are still operating, but the other informal sector didn't really get the needed help. For example, also in Addis, they provided subsidies for the state-owned companies, but they doubled the fares on minibuses and taxi operators. So they helped the operators, but then in turn, they also hurt the citizens. So now, I'm not sure if we really want to get back to this, but we do need to get somewhere. And our lives are starting up again, and people can't stay still. Mobility is a central key aspect of every part of people's lives, especially when they do live in urban areas. And thinking about this, when we talk about the digital mapping in transport, there's a lot of good key indicators that can be used. And if we can really map this data and track these things in real time, it can really give data that can be directly linked to the economic performance of a country. And predictions can be made based off this, and it can be very accurate, which in turn can then give the government these knowledge of how they should shape their policy and how they can react to certain situations in policy. And one picture, I mean, we know that digital and transport is very important, and buses and everything, but also bikes and cycling and all the other aspects of public transport systems can and should be integrated with the back on camera, with the transport and the digital side of things. So we've done many challenges and did mini grants all over the place, especially in Africa. We did in Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, Namibia, focusing mainly on active mobility. But it did give us great insights that the potential is there, and we can really move forward. And even now, working for the Toomey e-bus mission, we're starting this off now in a few deep dive and Menti cities. We believe that buses are the workhorses of any transport system, and whether it be 70 seats or a 4-seat bus, movement is essential. And we want to reach many cities, and I believe that data is a key, whether it be from a diesel bus or an electric bus. Having the right data of where people are moving, when they're moving, how they're moving, can really give a lot of insights. And this data is a currency which governments need to deal with better to make more informed decisions. And this value that we do now place on data also must be coveted, so others don't steal or exploit this data. And in the end, data is the tool to achieve the objectives. And we really do hope that we can find a way to come up with suitable solutions. Not sure if I took up the 10 minutes, but I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Frederick. That was fantastic. We really appreciate the really important work that Toomey is doing. And for those of you who don't know about Toomey, you should take a look at the website and join in that work as well. I think bringing up really critical social justice and equity issues, talking about livelihoods, subsidies, and also, you know, the skewed investment decisions is fundamental, and that data can play a role in highlighting some of those things. So thank you so much, Frederick. There's a lot that you have put on the table for us to discuss. I'm now going to invite Benji De La Pena for his contribution.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. Well, good morning from where I am, at least. I'm based in Seattle. Let me see if I can share my screen and let's get going. And thank you to Frederick and Fatima for great opening presentations. And I think that frames really, really well what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to pull us 40,000 foot view. I'm Benji De La Pena. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center and the chair of the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Let me tell you a little bit about the Global Partnership. We formed this last year because we want to elevate informal transportation and show that it is a global phenomena. And our mission is to work hand in hand with these transportation systems, leverage the new technology, and really we need to innovate alongside informal transportation for the reasons of climate change and also for social justice, because, and I'll go more into this, it is so important. It's been neglected for too long and totally ignored. A little bit more about ourselves. These are our partners, New Cities and Commotion, World Resources Institute, CPSU, Center for Sustainable Urban Development, Center for Sustainable Urban Development too, and then Interlink and the partnerships are going. A little bit of a nod to our board of advisors, just so to let you know that it's not just a bunch of transportation wonks, although we've got some really big experts there. We also have experts in mobility justice, like Dr. Mimi Scheller, and experts in informality, like Marty Chen, who is the founder of WeGo. This is our belief, right? It's a global phenomena, but it's always treated as a local problem and an emphasis on problem rather than assets. And so I like citing this quotation from Shack and Slum Dwellers International, who I got to work with a long time ago when I was in philanthropy, and really, really admire their work. And they like to say this: the first step to inclusion is to be counted. And I think the mapping, when we started out with the digital Matatu's work that Jackie and Sarah Williams led in University of Nairobi, that was exactly it, to show it, to make it visible, so that then we understand what it does, right? Because the imagination is, and it's not unique to African cities, it's everywhere, all over Asia and the global South, that once we're going to build those big informal systems that are modern, and all of this informality will disappear. And they don't, because the informal systems really serve people. And I think Fatima's research on this, the myth, that's excellent report. I think the question I'm going to pull us up to is, as we go beyond mapping, what are we building? And as we talk about what are we building, what's already there, right? Let's not have a settler mentality that there's nothing there and we're going to come and bring order. That's colonization. So there's already a system, an informal transportation system emerges from these ecosystems, right? And at the root of it are all of these layers. First, we need to acknowledge the history of racism and colonialism. We need to understand that there are dimensions of economic policy that shape this and why informal transportation emerges. There's the infrastructure, right? What do we build and not build? There's, as Fatima has noted, the density and sprawl of our cities and the speed that they are growing. I don't particularly like the framing that Guardian had, and it's been used a lot, of uncontrolled urbanism, because I always go back and ask, show me controlled urbanism. There really is no such thing as controlled urbanism, unless you go for those new cities, which haven't really worked either. And then so there's what vehicles are available, what is the business model, what are the mobility and policy regulations, and then what is the local culture? So it's a multi-dimensional system, and information technology is starting to layer on. What's happening too is we're getting a lot of handholds of being able to engage in this and change this system. But I go back to, if we are going to go beyond mapping and really the work, as I see it, is systems change, we have to acknowledge the existing system that's there. We also have to acknowledge the framing, right, that's happening. And this is you can hear it in language, right, of informal transportation is always problems to be solved, or it needs to be controlled, it's organized, it's old, it's decrepit. And technology is, it's new, it's the solution. We were going to deploy it, it's going to optimize, it's going to help us. And truth is somewhere in between these two things, right? So I'm going to take us out of Africa for a moment to share the experience that's happening in the Philippines and maybe pick up some lessons for it. The Philippines is hardly a model when it comes to dealing with informal transportation, and hardly a model for technology, but I think the current experience illuminates a few things. So this is about 3 systems. One, like I said, informal transportation is already there, and the transportation management system as it exists, and technology as it walks in. So Sakai.ph, like many other mapping apps, emerges, right? And what they do is they map the informal transportation system, mostly jeepneys and buses, and they said, well, here's a guide, right? And you can figure out where you want to go. Same model everywhere. One challenge, right, as a use case is, that's great if you don't know the system. If you're used to the system and you go where you need to go every day, it's of no use to you. And then their model, of course, is advertising based, their business model. The other biggest challenge was the system could really be helped if they had location data from the drivers, but there was no use case for the drivers. It's like, why do I need to use that app? There was no real reward for them. The picture on the right is a picture that went viral in the Philippines because there's this jeepney driver was playing Mobile Legends while driving and in traffic. So to make the point that there's a use case he can play, but with Mobile Legends, but the use case for a mapping tool, it really wasn't important to him. Act 2, let's go to jeepney drivers versus government. And Frederick talked about this. It's same thing happened. COVID hits, the transportation system is shut down, and the government is talking about we need to distance. Informal transportation, which is very innovative because they have to adapt. These are jeepney drivers who on their own say, we're going to put distancing. Look, we're going to put boxes in between people sitting. We'll put plastic. Let us run. And the government was saying, no, it's not enough. right? And we're not going to do that. And so, and they still haven't fully allowed all of the Jeeps to go. And it's so terrible that you have Jeepney drivers and operators, mostly Jeepney drivers, begging out on the streets for to get money to take food, to buy food for their families. That nexus allowed advocates to move and request for service contracting, to shift to service contracting, to pay the operators and the drivers to serve their routes. And the government started experimenting. There's a bit of a challenge now because the government didn't renew the budget. But they did. They started experimenting, and quickly they realized, oh, well, they need a system manager, because if we're going to do performance contracts, how are we going to know that the drivers completed the routes? So they got Sakai to be the system manager, and Sakai had the maps and then started putting trackers on the jeepneys. And then there was a use case for the jeepney drivers because, you know, that was a way to prove you did the route for the day and then you would get paid. Of course, there are problems, right? And this leads to kind of where the system fails. So what the government laid out was, well, you have to stay on the route and there are rules. And they were seeing in the maps that the jeepney drivers were diverting in certain places. So they would dock part of the pay saying you're violating the route, right? But the jeepney drivers were saying, well, that road has been under construction for the last year. That's why we can't pass there. And it shows that disconnect between the knowledge that the government has and is able to collect, right, versus what is actually happening in the system. The only source of information here really is real-time information, is the jeepney routes, but the government didn't have updated maps. They had digital maps from OpenStreetMaps or Google of where the routes are, but not the condition of those roads. And so if you're going to go into managing the system and one side is not updating, it's going to be problematic. There's also problems of control versus what did the drivers need. I don't know if they implemented this, but the government wanted, we want the app of the driver to show their speed and if they're overspeeding, which technically is problematic if you are in a dense city or cities with high buildings, right? Because you've got GPS signals bouncing left and right. So you couldn't actually predict, get an accurate reading of speed. The other was it wasn't really important to the drivers. So full caveat, I was advising Sakai PH through some of this. And what was important to the drivers was, what's the headway between me and the driver ahead of me, right? So that I'm not overtaking him, right? And it would have been better if they gave headway data, but that shows you those two systems, right? Which is one wanted control, the other one said, well, you know, this is the information that's important to us. So really, these are two worlds colliding. I included this far side picture just because I really like it, but it's a really great metaphor of systems not understanding each other. And that leads me to what the differences of these two systems that we, as people trying to move forward with digitalization of, particularly of informal transportation. These are two very different systems. They're large technological systems and inverse infrastructure, as Free called it, which is infrastructure that is inverted. It comes from the bottom up. So here's an example of large technical systems, right, that are organized, the bus rapid transit systems or the highway systems as we build them. And here's an example of bottom-up organization. So this emerged from very different places. On the left is Pangkalan stations of two-wheeler taxis, ojeks in Jakarta. They were self-organized just so that it's easier to go somewhere to get a ojek ride. And the one on the right is stages in Kampala, again self-organized by boda drivers for a place to rest, and it was easier to get a ride. So these two systems, right, exist, and what we're trying to do is bridge between them. Large technical systems work on hierarchies. You have experts and managers. There's about planning the thing and designing it. There are control structures, and it almost always results in some sort of predictable behavior. You might challenge that in terms of traffic, but there's predictable behavior. Inverse infrastructure or bottoms-up infrastructure is self-organizing. It's emergent. It's about networks of trust. and it's adaptive and co-evolving. So it's always changing and adapting to what's happening. And if you act on it, you never know what the results are. So because it's not linear. Right? So I think as we go into beyond mapping and trying to think about how do we use these digital systems, we first understand what are the existing systems, what are their goals, and as we plan out our interventions and what we imagine the future to be, we have to ask these questions, right? What are the goals of the system? What are the values that guide the system? And famous quote, right, is technology is neither good nor bad, but it's not neutral, right? So we need to be very clear as we deploy digital technology, what are the values, right? And then the most important question in terms of equity is who has the power in the system? And by digitizing things, are we facilitating that power relationship? Are we creating new power aggregations? Who gets control? Right. So these I stole from Professor Eve Middleton Kelly from London School of Economics, and it's so if you are working with inverse infrastructures with bottom-up systems, you want to build an enabling environment. And I think this is part of the discussion we need to have. How do you equip the people who are operating these systems, who are employed by these systems, so that they participate in it and it's not a colonial imperialist project of bringing order, right? And the three things are, you have to understand and work with the complex systems, right? And complex being both the inverse and the large technical systems. And instead of constraining them, instead of setting rules, you have to facilitate the self-organization. I think Fatima had a really good example of the cooperatives that work in Maputo that's starting to happen. And in most places too, there are always cooperatives, some form of organization that happens. We have to see the complex systems as multidimensional. Like I said in the slides of the layers of informal transportation, right? Is that there are cultural aspects, organizational aspects, etc. Right? And because they are complex systems, there's no single cause or linear causality, right? So you can't just say we're going to work on this one thing now. You have to take account all the dimensions and understand the relationships between those dimensions. And you have to create multiple strategies at multiple scales. Scales being, how does it work for the individual, like the driver and his information needs? How does it work for the organization, like the cooperative or the pangkalan or the stage? And how does it work for the government, right? And the way they manage the system. So I'll end there, but I'll leave you with a couple of links to where we discuss some of this. And again, remind you, this is what we believe in the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. And lastly, I'll leave you with one last quote, which is a mistake I see a lot in, or I'm going to say mistake, but that's judgmental of me, in transportation and the way we think about transportation, is that we think order, right, is the thing we want without thinking about how it's actually working for the users. And it's not to say that we shouldn't try to correct the disorder, but uniformity and order is largely about control and civilizing this. And so we need to be very, very conscious of that as we go beyond the initial mapping exercises to thinking about how are we changing these systems. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Benji. That again was is a lot to think about. I really liked how you brought up the questions of who controls this, the technologies, and what are the values, like Frederick was talking about, that we want to see expressed in our transportation system, and also how we're approaching the use of technology to improve these systems. We're going to come back to a lot of what you've put on the table for us. So last but not least, it's my pleasure to invite Director Shiaka to talk to us about how all these different issues are playing out in Freetown as he tries to really improve the transport system there for residents.
Thank you, Jackie. Are you hearing me at all?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Fatima and Frederick and Benji for a mouthful. It's a lot of information right now. I want to stay simple to just see how the case of Freetown has worked. And this presentation is in no way to say we are the gold standard. In fact, we are no standard. We are all learning and trying to evolve given the various contexts we have. So I will be focusing my presentation on how we did map and how we have applied that mapping to some policy and projects. So I will share my screen and I hope we are all seeing it. So I will start. Are we all seeing the screen, please?
Yes, looks good. If you want to go into presentation mode, we'll see a full screen.
Yes, okay. Is that okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, great. I'll just want to start by making some few opening statements that we decided as a ministry, as a policy oversight ministry in the industry, that data collection is extremely important for us in this scarce environment. When Fatima was presenting, she mentioned clearly that one of the conspicuous factors when you come to Africa is how you get data or finding data in the public space and for public transport can be challenging. So in this scarce space, we thought that technology will help to map data and see how we can apply it so that we can plan properly and better for more resilient urban transport system and understand how it impacts various sectors, as Benji has said. But we also wanted to create the balance. And I appreciate the Benji's presentation because there are some myths about informal transport. You have the extreme that says just wipe all of them out and that is it, let's start clean. But there are systems that have been serving the people for an indefinite long period of time. Of course, we need to improve, we need to adapt as urban growth takes place, but they are part of the system and they are people who are fending for themselves as well. So I think that balance in getting the system to work for the users, but also ordering it in a way that affects and creates efficiency is the balance we looked into by finding out using digital data to answer certain questions. My second part will be focusing on how we applied it. There were three areas we looked at when we were planning this: is how people move and the public transport options available to access jobs and services from different neighborhoods and communities. Second way is how public transport systems can be planned better using this digital mapping data. And then the third one is that how to address the issues of resilience of the urban transport system in a highly vulnerable environment to natural disasters. So this will be the areas I'm focusing on. So I will start by going into the tools we've used to date. As you can see here, we are trying to improve public transport in Sierra Leone. The context has been articulated in detail by Fatima and to some extent by Benji, and of course the COVID impact by Frederick. So I wouldn't go into all of that. It is on those background I will write to say we want to improve public transport. And the tools that we have used in mapping some of the data we have collected to date in a pilot corridor we have established was the GTF data, the GIS tools, TransOne, OpenStreetMap, Where Is My Transport app. That is this app was on mobile phones that we use to track GPS movements of bodabodas. In Kenya, we call them matatus or jeepneys, as Benji was saying, to track their movements around the city and collect significant amount of data. There is one more I did not state in this slide that you're looking at, is we also collected disaster-prone, flood-prone areas, particularly in certain key intersections along the corridor we are intervening. For some context here, quickly, this is Sierra Leone map. We are talking about a city of 1.5 million people currently that in Freetown that we are looking at, and the GDP as shown. I just wanted you to contextualize the case study I'm talking about. The Freetown is climate prone sometimes. We have had landslides in the city. When it rains, we have two key seasons, but we have very high monsoon rains in Freetown as well. And when it rains, it does affect transport infrastructure and the flow and movement of people and the safe passages of public transport. In fact, sometimes it impacts it that it brings it to a halt. And these are because of heavy rains and the coastal erosions and sea level rises as well. Some of you would have heard of the 2017 landslide in August in Freetown that killed about 101,100. That is as far as it was declared, but affected way more than 6,000 people. As you can see, gradually the urbanization is eroding the green areas around the capital. This is because of urban sprawl as well. And it doesn't come with any form of clear planning, particularly for emergency use of transportation or medical access. So this is one of the context of the city we are talking about. The transport climate vulnerabilities are as shown in the picture. We are very clear, these are all pictures showing Freetown. When it rains, you see how the flooding takes place in different parts of Freetown. So this is the context in which we are planning and say, let's see how data will inform what we do, not just in moving people or goods, but in making the infrastructure resilient to changes in climate. And so in that context, the government, we are currently working on a $50 million project grant from the World Bank to help in improving urban transport in Sierra Leone. It's called the Sierra Leone Integrated Resilient Urban Mobility Project. That is ongoing as we speak. Now, when we started this, we worked together with the transport team in the bank, and one of the first steps we used in how we map was to work with the University of Sierra Leone and the engineering department, to work with the staff and some of the students in using the tools that I just mentioned above. These students were used to go out into the different parts of the city to map out movements and collect various metadata. So this is what it looks like in the city of Freetown. We are intervening in two main corridors. We have the East Corridor moving all this way to the Center Business District, and then we have the West Corridor moving all the way out into the peninsula. We also surveyed using the tools for boarding and highlighting, also known as the, just a minute. We call it the TransWand. This has been used in different parts of Africa. We worked with the bank's team as well to collect data and survey highlighting and boarding along the routes and to see the concentration and density of the demand for public transport in and around the corridor. And so if you look at this map, you realize that on the East Corridor, the demand far outweighs that in the West. And that has led us to, when I get to my second part, how we have planned not just the routes that we want to intervene, but how we distribute the rolling stock, which are the buses themselves. This is an example of the tool we used, the way the data was mapped and collected. This is a sample form that was used to go about the process. I wouldn't bore you with all these details, but these are different stations along the two corridors that we intervene in the West and in the East. We were detailing each of these corridors to see what happens, how many people are 500 meters away from stops of these buses. We use the existing, what we call informal sector poda stops to map out this data, because even if we are formalizing the system, we will use 80–90% of these same stops because these systems are operating well as we try to add additional layer of organization to them. So these are some of the stops we used along the corridor. So this is just a summary of the tools and how we went about collecting data. We used some applications and some software. Where is my transport, which was on a mobile data as a mobile phones that people used to track mobile phone usage and see how the mass transit is flowing using that mobile phone data. We went out into the podas themselves and went through up and down the routes to ensure we collect other metadata along the corridor. One of the final tools I mentioned is Where is my transport? It's an app that uses GPS data to collect various information along the routes. It was very useful to us as well. Now, the second bit for me is the interesting bit where how have we applied the data in transport planning? As I said, the core objective of the project is to modernize and improve public transport in Freetown, but it's within 2 pilot corridors. Based on the outcome, we will expand this to other parts of Freetown and into other urban cities around. So the first usage of the data we collected was to help us choose the corridor to intervene. And that was because of where we had the highest density and demand and movement of public transport users. So we arrived at using the East and West corridor. As you can see here, we're linked in all the way to a place called Jue in the East, was where we mapped as a first intervention. Also, we did the same from the Center Business District all the way to a place called Lumley, where we mapped as well. Now, if you look at the histogram in front of us, you see that the two highest bars in the middle was a population within 500 meters of where the stops along the corridor as we mapped. You find out that the density was in Baibure Road and in both are in the east, these 2 bars. So it clearly gave us the data that if we are applying a project to move people on public transport, the East corridor is a priority. Of course, the second 2 sets are in the West as well. So we did take the 2 sets of data showing the East and the West corridor, as you can see here. The darker, you see the red, the high density in terms of the meters away, 500 meters away from the various stops along these corridors in the West, and on this side, you will see is in the East. Now, we also use this data to analyze accessibility modeling. We looked at our existing situation in the Western corridor, in the East corridor, and in both of the corridors. The summary was that additional of 200,000 plus will have access to the CBD in 30 minutes. This came out based on the analysis of the data we had. And 90% of people, that's about 1 million plus people in the Western area will have access to the same Center Business District where you see Cotton Tree is a place in Freetown, which is the center of Freetown, this in the CBD. We'll have 60 minutes from 90% of these areas into the center of Freetown. So the lighter greens will tell you 30 minutes accessibility, the darker green and R accessibility from the West corridor to the East corridor. And this, the fourth quadrant will tell you when we combine both corridors. Again, it shows when we use the OpenStreetMap and the mobile phone data, it again gave us the same results from a different mapping process. Where you see the lines very thick, it tells you clearly the density and demand in public transport movement. Again, it came out that the East, from the dead East coming into the CBD, has a very high demand compared to the West corridor. So that is very, very clear as well. And because of that, we have use that to apply to how many bus stops we are going to use in the East Corridor and how many buses we will deploy in the East Corridor to calculate the headway. We have also used this data to help us plan in looking at how we manage the fares, because Freetown is not a very wealthy country. Many people who depend on public transport are not necessarily very wealthy people. And so we use this data as well to help us look at the demand and how we can work with the private sector providing the service in terms of pricing. So this is another area we did apply the mapping data we've received. Now, we got feed from various sources. We used the ferry route, which crossed the estuary from the mainland to the airport in Lungi. We did that as a feed in the data, in the GTFS data we used. We also used 10 large bus routes, 99 Puda Matatos Jeepney routes, and 23 shared taxis. These were the feeds and how we got them. They are all color-coded here for your viewing. Now, how did we improve our program, particularly the project we are working out using this data? Again, as I've mentioned, it helps us to identify the corridors for formalized bus operations. We are trying to reform the public transport sector and make it more efficient and effective. And so the routes, the vehicles, and the infrastructure has to work together for this reform to work well. And data from this helped us to say, let's identify these two busy routes as our pilot corridor. Also help us to formalize the route network planning through optimization of the existing routes. And of course, it also helps us, as I've said, identification of the formalized bus stops, how we deploy the bus stops and how many buses are needed in the West compared to the East. We have combined GTFS data with other data sets and data collection, including population data to understand accessibility to the existing transit network. We did not just use one tool, we used tools in combination with others to see that results make sense. Boarding and highlighting data was important to us to ensure where we locate terminals, but also bus stops. And of course, we use the OSM road networks to get combined frequency and seating capacity and number of routes. So these are all the metrics we end up analyzing for AM peak times and PM peak times. You will see the numbers in the East Corridor, 72,000, 91,000, as opposed to 22 in the West and 41 respectively. So over and again, if you are following this presentation, the stress is that the data informed us that the movement in the East really doubles that of the West. That gives us clear indication of planning and policy and stress in the investments for the East Corridor compared to the West Corridor. Again, this is the routes and the map we are using in the project. So the blue lines tells you all the East Corridor from the center business district all the way to a place called number 2. And we have that of the East Corridor from the center business district all the way to a place called Jue. You will see that in distance-wise, the East Corridor seems shorter than the West, but in terms of density, demand, and movement, the East Corridor doubles that of the West Corridor. There are various reasons for that. I will not bore you with it, but one of it is that the West Corridor seems to be where the upper middle class and higher class lives, and most people have their vehicles, big houses, all the rest. And the east end of the city, it's really where the most of the working class and lower middle class people occupy. So that the population density in the East really is higher compared to the West, and hence the corresponding demand for public transport. And with this, I just want to say thank you. And thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open to questions later on. Thank you. Over to you, Jack.
Wow. Really, really impressive work. It's a fantastic example of really incorporating data into planning in a really comprehensive way. And I just want to flag, I loved how you really looked at multiple modes, thinking about integrating them so that you're looking at your transportation system as a whole. I also loved how you are working with the academy. We haven't really talked about universities very much, but they're very important. This is where the next generation gets its tools and education and critical thinking, and they are going to be the ones that build the capacity when they get hired in the city and in the tech companies and operating, actors, transportation operators. So, so that was fantastic. And then last but not least, it was so important that you brought up the climate crisis and how critical it is to start thinking about that in the context of everything we're talking about. I loved how you brought in the flooding, doing the mapping around that. I'd be very curious to know how you used the flooding, information more in the transportation planning. And yeah, I mean, there's a huge discussion that's just emerging at the World Bank and other institutions on what kind of data do we need in order to decarbonize the whole transportation sector, including what we call informal transport. Without this kind of data, we can't really also properly address emissions for both air pollution and climate. So fantastic presentation. So we have a lot to discuss and we have little time. And I would like to privilege to some of the questions that came in. And I would like to start maybe asking Benji first about this informality and formality dichotomy that Mehul Malhotra asked in the Q&A. Should we be talking about informal transport, or should we just be focusing on addressing problematic informalities and working on multimodal systems? And, how are we going to navigate this question of informality that just keeps coming up at every forum? So maybe I'll start with you, Benji.
Well, I think the names we use for it indicate the neglect, right? And kind of a disdain that the formal organization have. I'm getting a feedback. You guys disdain that we have for these systems. So partly we need to call it something. Informal paratransit, which is it like transit? When it acts for the user, they can use it, right? So it works for them as transit. I like your term, popular transportation, because it's everywhere and everyone uses it. I think we need to keep the terms to call attention to how one side runs very differently and is treated very differently, right? In fact, though, if you look at, there's really interesting research by Gaurav Mittal from Singapore looking at a city in northern India, that the informality is actually defined by government. The government decides what is legal and what is not illegal. And it also calls to how they treat it and what regulatory instruments are used. In most cases in cities, the only regulatory instruments are fares, you collect it, right? Or you at some sort of limit to how much you can charge, and traffic controls. And so traffic regulation. So I think we need to keep that, if only to own it, and maybe liberate it, but call attention to the fact that it's ignored, but it is so essential to the majority of the populations in cities of the global south.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Does anyone else want to speak to that question? Okay. Yeah, so I would also like to follow up with you, Hindolo, about the flooding and the resiliency. How how are you integrating that into your planning, and what sorts of concrete efforts are you making? I think there is an interesting connection between diverse modes of transport and resiliency in your transportation system. And then there's also just really planning for these risks that are increasing with climate change. Sorry, you're on mute. Classic for us. New world, right?
Sorry. As you all know, urban development transcends just one sector. And that is in itself it's one of the biggest challenges in how we coordinate with others to get things done. But I agree with you. In our situation, we looked at clear intersections where when it rains, it floods, and when it floods, the buses cannot move. So when we were planning the project, we had this triangle of the reform, the rolling stock, and policies and the infrastructure. So this comes under the aspect of the infrastructure. What we didn't want too many engineering solutions to a public transport system, but there are times you cannot avoid that. You need some form of intervention in terms of civil works to ensure that drainages are properly laid out, culverts are properly done, to ensure that when it rains and it will not stop the buses moving to their next bus stop, and the bus stops are not flooded, because when they are flooded, nobody will sit there or wait there for the buses. But also, like we said, for now, we have the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers that are providing fantastic services. And fantastic in the sense, Freetown is like Kigali on the hills. So most of the time, people live in places where these normal public transports cannot access. The last mile, we'll call it. But I call it sometimes for us the last 5 miles, because they have to go further upwards into a hill. These two-wheelers make a lot of a difference for sick old women, for disabled people. They can go as far as possible to close to their door to get them transportation. And I think that is important. So in connecting it to the climate resilience aspect, Jackie, you asked, is the project is looking at how we will build resilience in the infrastructure to ensure we have continuous flow of transportation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really impressive. I don't think, I'm getting feedback too. I think we all have to be on mute when we're not talking. Yeah, I think that's really impressive, because my impression is that there's not a lot of that kind of thinking that's being integrated into transportation planning. And resiliency is also information, so people knowing, when something is flooded or some problem is happening, and so it feeds also into the data infrastructure. But really, really fascinating work you're doing. And I also love that you're bringing in the user perspective, because a lot of times these users are like the old mama or the school child, or they're neglected in the planning process. And I think we'll talk about that more next. Antoine.
Yes, just to add on what I just said about climate and vulnerability, just to say that, for instance, for AFD, now it will be kind of compulsory to provide the vulnerability study, and to define whether the project is resilient or not. And it's important for us, at least, because it will be used to classify it as a community climate or not. And it's so it can be very it's very important in terms of the way we can provide a loan, for instance, because it can be it's really a big help on this. So at least for donors and for IFIs, international IFIs, I think in the next future it will be like a must to have this kind of study and analysis before funding a project.
Thanks, Antoine. That's fantastic to know. Frederic, you talked about your deep concerns about, how these transportation systems across the globe but particularly in Africa, have been hit by COVID and the need for investment. And you're seeing, on top of, with the climate crisis, also a deep need in investment to decarbonize, to make systems cleaner. And the transport systems we're talking about are fundamental to that. Are you worried that we are not going to invest adequately in these improvements? What do you see from the donor perspective in terms of mobilizing the resources? And then, of course, Fatima, I'm going to ask you about how you think the interventions might be changing from, institutions like the World Bank in terms of planning, given everything we've talked about.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. I think this thing with the investment is a very tricky question, and I think I would rather start with public transport. It really is it's equity, creating equity within cities, within my headphone's dying, but the big thing I think is also how and I thought also with Indalo, how you guys have done it in Freetown. This builds the capacity of the cities, and it can only come within. And I don't think that somebody pouring in money from the outside is really going to help. It has to be from the inside out. And this also capacity building and all these other issues is really a question that needs to be addressed. But it's also a matter of how it's sold and how it's presented to the citizens and from the citizens out. And it's really a test of democracy, because mobility is something that everybody is impacted by. It doesn't matter if you're the president or if you're a person that doesn't even have money to take a bus. You're impacted by transport and mobility and crossing the streets and going to school and all the shifts, like the different layers of life that are affected by this. And I think that if we are to do this, and I see, yes, climate is a very important thing, but the questions of mobility and fairness and how mobility is done within cities really needs to be addressed. And even for us now with this e-bus mission that we're working on, we're focusing on Menti cities of 500 cities. And my question that I keep asking now is, okay, what is a city? Is it a city today, or is it a city people now that's a village of 20,000 people that in 2050 is going to be 3, 4, 5 million? And planning that properly now for the future. These long-term visions and long-term goals, it's hard to sell because politicians look for something now. But if we really look for systemic changes, I really feel that investing the future of cities, especially when it comes to Africa, these cities that are not cities yet, those are the ones that really should get the investment and really should be looked at for how can we change the world? Because I don't know, in Lagos with 81 million people, I don't know what you can do. We're working there too, and making sidewalks and things like that is good, but money well spent would be, and this is then comes back to the question of the donors, what's your impact for the money that you spend? And I think that now maybe Fatima, you could take this on, but it's a big problem and there's many different aspects that we have to choose.
Thanks. And clearly data is critical to understanding if your money is well spent. So just bringing that back.
Forgot to use that word. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. No, but it's, yeah. Thanks so much. Fatima.
Fatima, can you check your earphones? I think it switched the microphone. We can't hear you, but you are unmuted on Zoom.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great. Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so I was saying that I totally agree with what Frederick was mentioning. And I actually think that with COVID, with all the COVID impact and the existing situation and the climate crisis, the World Bank has rethought a little bit our kind of like a strategy globally and also in Africa. And I think it's interesting that it's very much aligned with the pledge that Ben mentioned at the beginning on resilience, inclusive and green growth of cities and countries. So within this big picture, there is going to be a lot of done in kind of like in activities that help in these three big ideas or big strategies, and urban transport is going to be one of them. And I think that I really hope that the project that Indolo is leading in Sierra Leone is going to be a very good example for other projects that are going to be done in the region, where there is a very good integration of the climate resilience part, where there is a good integration of the inclusion part of the population, and also when there is an overall movement towards a greening, towards more inclusive modes, so greener modes like walking, public transport, etc. So I think that probably COVID have shaken us a little bit to rethink what would be the best way to get impact in a sustainable way in Africa. So definitely urban transport has to be one of the top priorities.
Thanks so much. That's very encouraging to hear. And I think we'll all be continuing to learn from the work in Freetown. Benji, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, just a couple of notes. I mean, you're pointing to a very real issue, right? Which is what Global Partnership wants to do, is elevate informal transportation. And what we want to avoid is the whole, it's easier for the donors to say, here's a big project, we'll build that light rail system or BRT systems. We do need those, right? But then we ignore it. So there was a research that came out of South Africa from their Competitiveness Commission that showed where government investment was going in terms of transportation, and something like 67% was going to rail. Usage of rail and bus, the formal systems, were 3%. 76% were the minibus taxis, and there was only 1% government investment in it. And when the large funders, multilateral funders, think about what they're going to invest, usually that's led by the local cities, right? And the leadership and the national leadership. And if they don't use public informal transportation and they see it as a problem, that's not going to get resources. The other problematic frame is they go and say, we're going to solve it and we're going to buy big electric new vehicles. And so now you cut off all of the manufacturers of the existing vehicles. And then a lot of these systems, the existing operators don't know how to keep in shape and repair. So my suggestion is, right, we need to look at the existing system and fund that because they're very adaptable if we're given the right incentives. And so there is a lot, we've got a decade, right, at best to maybe keep it as 1.5 at 2. And if we start thinking about, oh, we're going to wait for that big system that'll take us 5 years to plan and 10 years to build, we'll be too late. Meanwhile, there's existing transportation system, the informal system, and we should be investing in that.
And to do that, we really need to understand
Absolutely.
it, and we really need to scale up the use of technologies to do so, to build the data infrastructure to improve these systems. I want to end, before I pass this over to Iman, with Hindolo and bring this back down to the African city level. What advice would you give to those working in cities right now across the continent who want to do more of this data-driven work? What kinds of approaches, strategies, or words of wisdom can you leave us with, since you have been really working so incredibly in this area? I think you're on mute. Sorry, this is the Zoom world.
I know, sorry. I was saying I would have just put up Fatima's last but one slide up. I think she summarized it very well in terms of if I would advise people working in African cities. The data is extremely, extremely important. We need to understand the informal sector and how it operates. I think Benji mentioned that. We should not go in there with this preconceived idea that they are all chaotic and they don't have any system and all. Let's try to understand how it operates. He just mentioned a very good statistic that he talked about, that you look at the investment vis-a-vis the usage in terms of population and how we organize around them. Because of time, I wouldn't go into what we are doing in the project to match the two, where we have 13 roads that these so-called informal transport will feed into the main bus routes. And that's what we are working at so that they still continue to be of use to the population. But also, I will advise that we invest in a lot of capacity building. In order to sustain our public transport, you need the knowledge base locally to uphold that. And that is extremely, extremely important. Fatima will not always be in Freetown. Benji will not always be in Freetown, but I will, and many other Sierra Leoneans. So when you build that capacity, that sustainability and transference of that capacity within the local setting is extremely important. My final advice will be that we look into the way enforcement is done and legislations overlap in Africa. There are some difficult circumstances between local and national governments, particularly where in those political settings, one party is the head of the mayor and the other party is in the national government. There are serious challenges. We should be able to know as external funders when we come into this system to look at how we get those overlaps to work eventually for the wider public. And I did say finally, Jackie, but second finally is, let's remember it's all about the people. For me, it's all about moving more people than those of us who own SUVs. It's about them, and let the end product be that they are being moved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are wonderful words of wisdom. Antoine, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I was wanted to jump in from what you just said about capacity building. I think that really one of the spirit of the Digital Transport for Africa initiative is really to be able to make this capacity building, and it can be different. It can be advocacy towards a decision maker. It can be really technical support to engage the local community. And here I want to say that if you have in a city, and there's a lot of cities in Africa where you have a very vibrant tech community or OpenStreetMap community, it's a very big opportunity to mobilize these people. I've seen that in the discussion we have people from like Enoch from Ghana, and it was amazing work with him because he's a young student, very involved in the civil society and OpenStreetMap community, and it was very helpful, and it was very a pleasure because it was really the community, the local community that were engaged towards data, and you say that you use a lot of OpenStreetMap data. I think it's a good way to engage also at least the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. We definitely have to rethink capacity building as not just putting somebody in a ministry or some, it's really like building, as Hindolo was saying, the local capacities and knowledge and power local actors, from the young people in the tech community to the young people who are going to get hired by the city, to take action to improve the lives of the people they love and the city they love. And I think that's really very much the spirit of this effort, is to bring many of those people together from across African cities to help each other out, and to provide open data, open tools, and the kind of support you need for that vision of capacity and support to address the challenges we all face in our cities, but which are often compounded in African cities by, we know, a very difficult history, to be honest. So I'm going to end this amazing discussion reluctantly, because I think we have so much more to say. I hope we're going to continue with some of the more tech issues tomorrow. And I'm going to pass it on, and let's continue this conversation through Digital Transport for Africa. And special thanks to Antoine and his team at AFD for really enabling us to have these conversations. And WRI, of course, which is, the Africa office has been, particularly active and fantastic. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Iman, who's been key in all of this to end this event.
Thank you, Jackie. Sorry, I'm going to keep my video off because of my connection, but I just want to thank all the panelists. I think all the presentations were really insightful and sparked a lot of discussion that I think will continue through more DT4A events in the coming 3 years. So I just want to, I don't want to take up more time, but really want to thank all the panelists, all the participants for joining, for actively participating, and for also staying over time just to be part of the discussion. So tomorrow we'll be having more sort of technical sort of presentations, but again, very short and really to give a flavor of some of the projects that are happening. Please go to the DT4A website for the agenda and bios for all the speakers. We really hope that you can join us tomorrow as well, and we hope to continue our engagements and our discussions with all of you. I wish you all a great day, and again, thank you to all the panelists.
Bye.